Overboarded is a fancy term meaning that a director serves on too many boards, so many that they can't properly do their jobs because they're just too busy. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek and I'm a big fan of yous. So with the pandemic sucking all the air out of the room, creating a crisis for pretty much every company out there, the issue of overboarding is one that has come to the fore over the past year. The notion of overboarding is not anything new. It really became something to be concerned about 2 decades ago when shareholders began to realize that directors were serving, some of them, not many, on as many as a dozen boards. And of course, they were just serving as rubber stamps for what the CEO wanted. So that most companies began to have policies limiting how many boards that their directors could serve on. According to this 2019 Spencer Stuart survey, nearly 80% of the S&P 500 have established some type of limit on their directors' ability to accept other corporate directorships. And almost all the companies that don't have a specific numerical limit do require their directors to notify the board chair or the corporate secretary before they do join another board, and encourage their directors to reasonably limit their board service. For the companies with a specific numeric overboarding limit, nearly 2/3 establish a limit of 3 or 4 additional public company boards, and that applies to all their directors. And about 1/3 say that directors who are actively employed, they're not retirees, cannot serve on more than 2 other outside public company boards. Nearly half restrict the number of other audit committees on which their audit committee members may serve, because serving on an audit committee takes up even more time. And about 1/4 of the S&P 500 set a specific limit in their corporate governance guidelines on their own CEO's outside board service, typically 1 or 2 outside board seats. That's it. And to wrap this up in a neat bow, the average S&P 500 director serves on 2 corporate boards. So this survey also says that 60% of the S&P 500 CEOs do not serve on any public company boards in addition to their own board, an increase from 51% 10 years ago. And CEOs who do accept other corporate directorships seem to do so sparingly. 37% of those serve only on 1 outside public company board, and just 4% serve on 2. Only 1 CEO serves on 3 outside public boards. And a decade ago, 16% of CEOs served on 2 or more public company boards. Now let's talk about the flip side, what the proxy advisors, what the institutional investors will tolerate in terms of how many board seats a director can have. This is one of those few odd areas where some institutional investors have policies that are actually stricter than what ISS has in their voting policy. And more investors began voting against directors they considered overboarded starting in 2019, actually before the pandemic hit, but it's only ramped up now that we're in crisis mode. These investors particularly have targeted active public company executives, those that are not retirees, who sit on more than 2 public company boards. Their support dropped by more than 25% in a single year for those directors. This Hunt and Andrews Kurth memo from a few years back included a chart from Morrow that nicely summarizes the various policies you should be aware of. It's notable that some of these policies are already outdated in 2 years, particularly the ISS and Glass Lewis ones. Right now, they stand that ISS's voting policy is 4 total boards for CEOs, that's the max, and 6 for other directors. And then for Glass Lewis, it's 3 for CEOs and 8 for other directors. 8, that's a lot. That's a pretty high bar. So I encourage you to watch this Proxy Season Roundup webcast that DFIN hosted in July 2020. PJT Camberview's Sheena Van Leuven at the 12-minute mark talks about overboarding and has this chart. An archive of that webinar is available under the Insights tab. It's available in an archive video. It's awesome. Sheena notes that some investors are tightening up on their own policies to further limit how many boards directors can serve on, and that investors are more closely enforcing their overboarding policies. Sheena also notes that investors are coalescing around 2 boards being acceptable for active CEOs, CEOs that serve on other public company boards, and 4 directorships for other directors, for non-CEOs. For example, that's the policy for BlackRock. That's the limits in their overboarding policy. And BlackRock has been strictly enforcing its policy for a year or 2 before the pandemic. Sheena also notes that some investors have branched out in their policies to limit board chairs or lead directors more than the other directors, starting to distinguish those people with those titles and those jobs And she gives State Street as an example of this in this area. So check out that DFIN webinar in the 3 minutes that Sheena spends on the topic. It's really good stuff. So back to my original question, just how overboarded are directors? Are they too busy to do their job properly? Unless you're in that particular director's shoes or you're working with that director really closely, we really don't know. We don't know how busy they are, how much they're able to pay attention, how much they're really thinking about their board service. Ideally, board evaluations could tease this out if there were effective individual director evaluations, particularly peer evaluations, but I don't think we'll ever see a sea change shift to peer evaluations being conducted, nor do I think even if we did that they would be effective. It's too strange a thing to rat out on your fellow director. I don't think it would ever be a true thing, and I don't blame directors for not ratting out their fellow director. They're supposed to be collegial. One pretty big limitation of the SEC's item 401E2 of Regulation SK disclosure requirement, that's the disclosure requirement for how many other public company boards that a director sits on now or has sat on for the past 5 years, is that it's just limited to public company boards. There's no disclosure about directors who sit on the boards for private companies, nonprofits, foundations. Those aren't disclosed in the proxy unless a company discloses that voluntarily. So that's an activity, obviously, that would keep a director pretty busy. Of course, then they have their day jobs, perhaps, or just their personal lives. They might be busy in other ways. So there's, of course, no way of really knowing the full story of how busy a director really is and how much capacity for work does this person have right now. It's a tough issue, and bright line tests aren't the perfect fix, but it's probably the best we can do, short of a director being honest and saying, hey, I'm too busy to be on this board right now. That's just unlikely to happen except in the rarest of cases. That's what I think. Let me know what you think.